Guys, today I'm excited. I'm excited for one reason. We're going back to the beginning of recorded history. Beyond this point, it is said that civilization just did not exist. Writing wasn't even invented yet. We're literally talking about one of the very first civilizations to have ever emerged. We're talking about the ancient Egyptians, and more specifically, their pharaohs. Who were they? What kind of power did they have? Everything that you need to know, we're gonna talk about. Welcome to Vlogs of Knowledge. Ancient Egypt is one of the very first civilizations to have emerged. Historians date it back to the year 3500 BC, lasting all the way up to the year 30 BC. Now that's over 30 years of history for just one civilization, so don't expect everything that I'm going to talk about to apply to that whole time span. Some things apply only to the beginning, while other things apply more towards the end. The Egyptians were one of the very first people to discover writing, which is good for us from a historical standpoint because we get to know and learn about their society and how they lived their lives. But before we start to talk about pharaohs and all that good stuff, I always like to provide some historical context so that you understand kind of what I'm talking about. So ancient Egypt was comprised of two parts. There was Upper Egypt and then there was Lower Egypt. The terms Upper and Lower Egypt simply refer to the direction of the Nile River. Now the Nile River was the main source of water for the ancient Egyptians, and it would flow from the Upper Egypt because it was higher in altitude to Lower Egypt. And because of that, Egypt became and was always referred to as the two lands, and a pharaoh was supposed to rule over both lands, both Upper and Lower Egypt. Ancient Egypt was a kingdom, and what does a kingdom have? Well, it has to have a king. Except that we refer to those kings as pharaohs, but the Egyptians, they saw their pharaohs as kings, as simple rulers. But as I've mentioned, the Egyptian civilization was over 3,000 years long, so pharaohs, they were seen differently throughout the years. They started as gods, then they were downgraded to demigods or half-gods, and then eventually further down to just representatives of God. So there's a sort of downward trend in their divinity. But even then, the pharaohs were very powerful. They literally had all of the power in Egyptian society, as a monarch should. They decided if you go to war or not, they decided anything religious or even judicial. They had the last word on everything. Now since ancient Egyptian civilization is so long, you can be sure that there were a lot of pharaohs. But to keep things simple and organized, we're gonna group them by dynasty and then by kingdom. There were a lot of kingdoms, each lasting about several hundred years each, and within each of those kingdoms there were several dynasties. Now for those who don't know, a dynasty is essentially what you get when you have a pharaoh or somebody in power that dies and then passes the power down to his son, and then the son passes it down to his son, and so on. As long as the bloodline remains the same, as long as it's the same family, that's one dynasty. As soon as, for example, there is no firstborn son and then the power goes to somebody else in a different family with a different blood, then that becomes a different dynasty. The power was usually passed down from father to son, but of course, like anything, there were exceptions. There's war, there's murder, there's assassinations, anything can happen. And of course, sometimes it happened that there was a female pharaoh, like those were a thing. But the Egyptians, they really wanted to do their best to keep the bloodline pure. They went so far as to marry their sisters and half-sisters just to keep the power within the same family. From young, the pharaohs would receive extensive physical and war training. The truth is that the pharaohs, they fought the wars with the Egyptians, sometimes even in the front lines. These people were very brave. They would also learn to ride and break a horse, ride and fight on a chariot, and they had impressive cardio skills. I guess they had to, right? Depending on where you're looking at, they were seen as gods or demigods or representatives of God. They still had that touch of divinity. They were not expected to act like humans. They were expected to be superhuman. So they had to have extensive physical training to go with that. New pharaohs would get their power only after the previous one had died. And even then, they still had to go through a long ceremony that could last well up to a year before they saw any power. And just to talk about some of the things that they had to do for the ceremony, well, first they had to attend the burial of the previous pharaoh, which makes sense, it's kind of obvious, and then they had to present themselves before the Egyptian people wearing three different crowns. First it was the white crown, signifying Upper Egypt, then it was the red crown, signifying Lower Egypt, and then finally the red and white crown, signifying the unification of the two lands. Pharaohs, when they would talk, they would wear the appropriate crown. So let me give you an example. Let's say a pharaoh was talking to the Egyptian people about something that only concerns Upper Egypt. He would only wear the white crown. But instead, if he was talking about something that only concerns Lower Egypt, he would wear the red crown. And of course, if it was something that talks about Upper and Lower Egypt, he would wear the red and white crown. The pharaoh's main purpose for the Egyptian people was to maintain something called the Mayet, which simply means peace, balance, and prosperity for the Egyptian people. It was always believed that the pharaoh was in direct contact with the gods, whether that he was a god himself, or a demigod, or just a representative of God. He was always talking with the gods, and he had to do what the gods wanted. If that meant that Egypt had to go to war to secure resources for the Egyptian people so that they could have a better life, well, that's what the pharaoh had to do. If the pharaoh had to be at peace, well, that's what he had to do. He had to do whatever the gods wanted. And of course, the gods, they wanted peace and prosperity for the Egyptian people. But luckily for the pharaohs, they didn't have to go to war all that often. I mean, half of the Egyptian civilization was at peace. And this is simply because Egypt is surrounded by a desert, so it's kind of hard for an army to invade Egypt if they have to cross a long and lengthy desert to get there. But besides going to war and caring for the people, pharaohs also built a lot of stuff. They built monuments and statues to represent and show off their status and magnificence. One very famous pharaoh is Ramses II. He built the most monuments and the most statues than any single pharaoh before him. And he also lived to the age of 80 years old, which is very unusual considering the fact that ancient Egyptians were only expected to live till about 40. I mean, people were convinced he was a god. And of course, how can we talk about ancient Egypt without talking about the Great Pyramids? That's what the pharaohs built too. I'm not going to go into detail about how they were built because that's a whole video on its own, but I will talk about why they were built. Pyramids were the burial places of the pharaohs. It was believed that when a pharaoh was dead, he would become Osiris, the god of the dead, the god of the afterlife. But there was one condition. His body had to be well preserved. The ancient Egyptians believed that body preservation was essential to the soul's survival in the afterlife, which is why we get so many mummies. But of course, if you're going to bury a pharaoh with all of his personal treasures in a huge pyramid, that's like holding up a sign that says, "Please come and rob me." And of course, grave robbers came in, they went to the tomb, and they took whatever they could find. But eventually, the ancient Egyptians, they learned their lesson, they stopped building the pyramids, and they moved their pharaohs to a place called the Valley of the Kings. That place was a little more underground, it was meant to keep the grave robbers away. But even that didn't work because when we discovered those places, when we discovered the Valley of the Kings, grave robbers had already been and they took whatever they can find. All of this talk about Egypt and pharaohs raises a few questions. For one, well, what happened to pharaohs? Why don't we have pharaohs anymore? And what happened to ancient Egypt? I mean, it lasted 3,000 years, why not more? The answer to that is simple, but it's also kind of sad. Egypt has had many wars and not all wars they were able to win. For example, in the year 500 BC when they fought the Persians won and then they invaded Egypt. They still kept the pharaohs and they still kept the Egyptian culture more or less, but after that point Egypt was never the same. After the Persians it was the Greeks with Alexander the Great, and after the Greeks it was the Romans. And while they were fighting with the Romans there was one pharaoh left, Cleopatra VII, but she died in the year 30 BC. And after that Egypt became a province of the Roman Empire and the pharaohs were no more. So it's kind of sad, but you had to see it coming, right? And that covers the general idea of pharaohs and ancient Egypt. I hope that you've learned something. I hope that you've enjoyed this video, and leave me a comment. What was your favorite part of the video? What surprised you about pharaohs? I mean, what did you not know? I'd love to know, and trust me, I will read all of your comments. With that being said, my name has been Darius Cousin. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I will see you all next week. Alright, that was it for this week's episode of Vlogs of Knowledge. I really do hope that you've liked this episode and that you've learned something. If you did, please leave a like, share it to a friend, and subscribe to be notified when the next episode comes out. Remember that these episodes come out every single Monday, and if you've missed the previous one, there's a link on your screen. If not, there's a link in the description. Make sure to check it out, it's very interesting. As always, I'm your host, Darius Cousin. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I will see you all next week.